Hello and welcome to a lesson this time in high altitude training. So a reminder in regards to these presentations, the yellow text boxes are tasks for students, the green text boxes are the note-taking sections for students, the blue text boxes are the differentiation tasks, and the red text boxes are the teaching and learning strategies and ideas. So in regards to this topic, the syllabus requires us to know what we mean by high altitude training. So you need to be aware of the concept of high altitude training, and then you've got to understand the process of high altitude training. So how does it exactly work? And then think about both the benefits and also the negatives of this type of training on the performer, and ultimately why is the performer using this type of training to gain an advantage. So if we first and foremost look at this concept of high altitude training, this is a type of training which is used by elite athletes, top athletes, which prepares them for their specific competition. So when we talk about high altitude, we're talking about how high above sea level we are exercising. So by high altitude, we're talking about, in essence, about 2,000 meters or more above sea level. Okay, so the type of places where high altitude will occur will be up in the mountains, for example in the Himalayas and parts of Africa and so on. And this often involves a lot of travel to different parts of the world in order to be able to perform and do high altitude training. So what's the purpose of high altitude training? In essence, we're talking about an aerobic type of training. So training with oxygen. And ultimately, we're looking to train our aerobic energy system. Okay, so that's with oxygen. And we're also looking to improve the cardiovascular endurance. Okay, so the ability of the heart to pump blood to the working muscles, getting that oxygen to the working muscles so we don't fatigue as quickly. So pause your video here, look at this question. So why might an athlete want to train at high altitude? See if you can come up with an answer. Okay, so ultimately one of the things that you might mention is about the fact that they're trying to gain an advantage over their competitor. You may have talked about the fact that yes, they are training their aerobic energy system and they're improving their cardiovascular system. Okay, so ultimately they're trying to perform for longer and be able to perform and train for longer without fatigue. Okay, so in essence we're talking about long distance running. We're talking about endurance activities in essence, okay, so whether it be cycling, rowing and so on. Now, if we think of some of the other benefits in terms of high altitude training, we have mentioned about the fact that we are improving our aerobic stamina, but we're also looking to increase the amount of red blood cells, okay, so the red blood cell count, and we're going to talk about why that happens on the next slide in regards to the process. And if we increase our red blood cell count, in essence, we are also increasing our oxygen intake, okay, so our uptake in regards to VO2 max, and also this aspect of being able to increase our capacity to carry oxygen. So when we talk about VO2 max, this is the way that the body can consume oxygen. Okay, so we might carry it through more red blood cells, but then we need to ensure that our body is efficient to be able to uptake that oxygen and consume it into the working muscles in essence. We're also looking to improve our running times, our speed, okay, and that's the whole purpose in regards to performance when we're thinking about high altitude training. And ultimately, we're looking at that key word there of acclimatise. So by the term acclimatise, we're looking at getting our body to adapt, to be modified, to change a little bit. Okay, in essence, if we're acclimatising to that particular climate, that particular environment, then our body is going to adapt to that particular environment, okay, ready for competition. So in regards to the process of high altitude training, this is how the process works. So in essence, an individual or team for that matter will train at high altitude. So as I said before, geographically speaking, we're looking at places that are 2,000 meters or above sea level. At this stage, when we're 2,000 meters above sea level, we have got a low pressure system. So there are less air molecules in the air. And that means that there'll be less oxygen in the air at this high altitude. Now, as that's the case, that makes training more difficult for us, because if we're finding it difficult and there's less oxygen in the air for us to consume and breathe in, we're going to find training difficult, whether we're playing football, whether we're playing rugby, whether we're running, and so on. So as the body finds it difficult and finds it harder to train in this environment, what it does is it decides to compensate. So what it does, it decides to create more red blood cells, because ultimately, as there's less oxygen in the air, we need to counterbalance that. We need to get the oxygen to the working muscles when we're training. So the body is clever enough to change, to create and make more red blood cells. So next question for you in terms of being able to pause, write this down and see if you can come up with the answer. So explain how the increase in red blood cells will help the sporting performer. Okay, we'll look at that first question in a second, but again, try and answer this next question. What benefits will exist when the athlete returns to sea level to compete in a competition? Pause your video here. And then the third and final question in terms of a differentiated question, are there any benefits for anaerobic athletes? Okay, so if we look at that first question, first of all, in terms of, what's the benefit to increase our red blood cell count? Obviously, the red blood cells, they carry oxygen to the working muscles. So if we've got an increase in red blood cells, then we're going to hopefully get more oxygen to the working muscles, okay, which is going to help us not fatigue as quickly. So we're going to be able to last longer in regards to our endurance events. The second question, in terms of what the benefits will be when the athlete returns to sea level to compete, well, the fact that our body's overcompensated and created more red blood cells means ultimately that when we come back to sea level, it should be easier to train or to perform, because obviously at sea level we have a higher pressure, so we have more air molecules and we have more oxygen at that specific low level. Okay, so the fact that we've got more red blood cells means that we'll be able to carry even more oxygen, and again that hopefully means that we should be able to hopefully run slightly faster and fatigue less quickly. And the third and final question, are there benefits for anaerobic athletes? Well, the answer to that question is yes, there are. But specifically speaking, for the GCSE syllabus, we are mainly talking about aerobic athletes here, so endurance athletes. So high altitude can help with some anaerobic sports, so us throwing further and explosive power. But for the exam, I want you to be really clear in making sure that you talk mainly about aerobic athletes, so endurance events specifically. Okay, so the next question here, what are the negatives to high altitude training? So pause your video here, see if you can branch some ideas out through a little mini spider diagram, the negatives to high altitude training. Okay, so there are some negatives that are associated with high altitude training. So one of them is this concept and this idea of detraining. Okay, and this can occur due to the fact that as it's difficult to train at that high altitude, our intensity can't be as high because there's that lack of oxygen. Okay, so we might actually regress, we might actually go backwards in regards to our training level because we're not training as intently and intensely, because ultimately there's less oxygen in the air. The second problem, and you may have had this before, if you've been on holiday, for example, if you've gone skiing, for example, and you may have gone via coach towards the end to get to your chalet and so on, is altitude sickness. Okay, and this can come about due to the fact that we've got low pressure, we've got less oxygen in the air, and that's starting to starve our vital organs, so such as our brain. This can also impact in regards to dehydration, because a lot of high altitude places exist with also humidity in terms of places like Brazil, Nepal, and so on. Now, there are also psychological issues. Okay, so if we're training far away from home, the performer might get homesick. We can use other alternatives. So there are other things that we can use. Hypoxic tents, oxygen tents, and these are kind of man-made, manufactured kind of dome-shaped spaces or rooms that have been modified, as you can see in the picture on the right-hand side of this presentation, where we can change the oxygen levels inside that specific room. And ultimately that can be bit more cost effective rather than having to go to a specific country abroad. The benefits themselves in regards to high altitude training, okay, are lost relatively quickly. So although we do get an increase and a spike in red blood cell count, okay, when we come back to sea level, those benefits will only last between 1 to 3 or 4 days or so. Okay, so it's relatively a short period of time in regards to being able to increase our performance levels. And as I said there, the bottom one, geographically, obviously a lot of high altitude places are far away, so there can be an expense involved in regards to that as well. Okay, finally for the teaching and learning, ideas and strategies for the practitioners. Looking at this concept in regards to linking pictures, so you could create a slide where you've got 4 or 5 different pictures, including things like the mountains, hypoxic chambers, just playing sport in general, and red blood cells. And can you get some of the students at the start of the lesson, before they've even looked at this topic, what's kind of the links in terms of with the pictures, and talk through that in terms of a discussion. You might then introduce some different key terminology, so can they express the links through the key terms that you've maybe written up on the whiteboard or through a differentiated handout. Also look at some videos. There are some really good videos in terms of altitude training. Look at Mo Farah, for example, and other sporting athletes who work at high altitude. And then even things like hypoxic chambers, you'll be able to find sports science videos in regards to this to show your students as well. And then finally, there are lots and lots of questions, exam practice questions on high altitude training. It seems quite a popular question that the exam board go for. So best of luck with this task. I hope that's explained this topic for you.